Hello, my name is Olorotimiosha. Today is July the 12th, 2026. It's a Sunday, so I'm doing a deep dive into the Bible. I'm continuing with my discussion on immigrants and patriarchs, right? Patriarchs in the Bible, right? The Old Testament, who were immigrants. And if we recall, uh, although God had instructed the children of Israel after they were delivered from bondage uh, in Egypt, and Moses was their leader, that they should treat foreigners well. Now, in an earlier video I explained that foreigners, sojourners, right? They're used synonymously in the Bible, and that's what we'd call immigrants today, right? So immigrant is a more modern term, but back then they'd use foreigners or sojourner, right? So, um, and I remember I also talked about the 10th commandment where God says that, do not covet anything that, is your neighbor's, right? Covet, the synonym for covet is envy. So now I'm going to quickly remind us of something that, God told the children of Israel after they were delivered from bondage, and God gave them laws and, statutes to follow, to obey, that, including that they should not mistreat foreigners. So I'm going to quickly read from Leviticus, book of Leviticus, chapter 19. I'll start from 33, verse 33. Excuse me. And, excuse me. And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Right? So that's it in the book of Leviticus, that the children of Israel, are warned, but they're righteous people. So that's God telling righteous people not to mistreat immigrants. So if people are righteous, right, and they fear God, then they will obey God's ordinance, right? God's commandment that they should not mistreat foreigners or immigrants. Again, foreigner, sojourner, those are synonymous terms for the modern world term immigrant. However, you'll find that the patriarchs, right, were often immigrants. They were wandering about a lot. So you find that as they wandered, like Abraham and his son Isaac, that they faced perils. They were often mistreated, right, by amongst the people that they lived with. I did an earlier video at one point about how God had blessed Isaac, and the Philistines whom he lived among had, kept on seizing his wells out of envy, and he'd have to move somewhere else again, dig up new wells again, right? And then they'd seize it again, and they just kept repeating the same process, right? Until God finally made room for them, and the oppression stopped, and God blessed Isaac. Now, importantly, as I was saying, as they wandered, we find that even Abraham, right? Abraham, when he was wandering, he went to a place called Gerar, right? Find it interesting, a place called Gerar, and he met a king, Abimelech, right? And because Abraham feared that the people there were ungodly, that they would kill him to take his wife, Sarah. And so he, out of the fear, he would lie. So you see immigrants doing these things sometimes as well. So he lied and said, he told Sarah he had an agreement with her that she should claim she was his sister so that they would not kill him, right? To take her, right? Because they coveted what he had. That happened with Abimelech in Gerar and Abraham. What's interesting is it happened with his son as well, Isaac. When Isaac married Rebekah, they went to this same Gerar, right? And there was this king, Abimelech, as well. And Isaac told Rebekah the same thing, that she should tell, she should claim to be his sister so they wouldn't kill him, right? So it's kind of interesting. But something happened. I'm going to read from Genesis 26, verse 12. And I'll move on to just have a narrative of, do a narrative of what I want to talk about. How God blesses, his people who are immigrants, right? But when he blesses them, their hosts become envious and want to take possession of what they have, even up to killing them, right? And you can see that's why Abraham and Isaac, right, they did the same thing in the same place with these same kings, right? They feared that they would kill them, and each time they had an agreement with their wives to lie, to misrepresent themselves as, their sisters, not their wives, so they wouldn't be killed, right? At least they, a brother of the sister would be favored in a suitor. The suitor would want to curry favor, but a suitor would try and eliminate a husband, right, an existing husband, so he could take possession of, of whether it's Sarah or Rebecca, right? It didn't turn out that way. Things ended up well for them. But just to show you the sort of fear, the trepidation that immigrants experience in foreign lands, they're aware that their hosts, could be violent enough to want to kill them so that they could violate their rights or take possession of, their property or even their wives, right? So that's something to bear in mind. Now I'm going to quickly read from Genesis chapter 26 from verse 12. Then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him, right? You see, the Philistines envied him, right? That's a violation of the 10th commandment. So these people are not righteous people, and you can see as it goes on, they try to undermine him, sabotage or dispossess him of his property, of his wells, and so on and so forth. So today, something I'm going to also talk about are other Bible characters, right? All the prophets in the Bible, like Daniel. The story of Daniel, we know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel was one of the children of Israel, who were taken during the Babylonian captivity, when Babylonians captured Judah, the children of Israel, and then they took them, transported them, and held them captives. Now, the kings decided that they were going to raise some boys who could serve as courtiers, right, and learn the arts of the Babylonians, and Daniel was one of them. But Daniel chose not to eat from, the table of the kings, and he requested this, that that they wouldn't eat from the table of the king, and God blessed them. They were fresh, even they didn't eat, consume the same things that their hosts, their Babylonian hosts, had. Now, at some point, Daniel was so favored, right, because he interpreted the dreams of the king. He was so favored. He was made a governor. In fact, they use the word like president, one of the presidents, right, in the province, in the kingdom, and the empire. And he was very favored, and he was one of the ruling administrators for the king. But Daniel worshipped God, and so he already, because of his success, great success, just like an immigrant being successful, his rivals envied him, right? The people who were from Babylon envied him, because Daniel was not a Babylonian. He was an immigrant, right? He had been taken captive, but because of his skills, right, he was elevated by the king. And so they sought ways to undermine him, and they couldn't find ways to sabotage him, to defame him, to strip him of his honors and humiliate him. They couldn't find anything. So, but they knew that The only way was through his religion, his faith in God. He worshipped God. So they urged the king to pass a law that nobody could petition any god, any other person but him, right? So in that was the way they were going to ensnare Daniel. But Daniel continued to pray to God, kneel down, bow and pray and petition and give supplication, make supplication to the Lord Almighty. And he was guilty in this, and eventually the penalty was that whoever violated the laws of the kings, the land of they were called the Medes and the Persians, right? Then they would be thrown into the lion's den. So you know what happens when you're thrown into a lion's den? You're going to be consumed by lions. But Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, but he wasn't consumed. God protected him, right? So I'm going to do another video and I'm going to read the scripture. It's important to read the scripture. In this era that they say 54% of adults, right, are not able to read. They read at the level of a 10-year-old. So I don't want to be amongst them. So I'm going to get into the habit of, encouraging us to read the Bible, right? To read as one learns about the Bible. And so I'm going to read in a subsequent video. So Daniel escaped that because God protected him. But you see the persecution from the envy. And, it goes on and on. Daniel was not the only instance. If we recall, in the case of Esther and her cousin Mordecai, while they were held, in Persia, when Persia was the largest empire, and Esther, who was actually Jewish, Mordecai was Jewish, but the king didn't know, and she got married to King Xerxes, right? Historic King Xerxes, and there was a powerful administrator who envied Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew, but Mordecai was elevated as well. And Mordecai refused to bow down, be obsequious, or be an apple polisher, for Haman. And Haman hated him as a result. And Haman was going to sabotage him and had a gallows built. And he urged, he spread falsehoods against the Jews, and to have the king commit genocide, to make a law committing genocide of the Jews. But God turned it around, and instead the gallows that Haman had staged to execute Mordecai served as a gallows for his own execution and his children. So you see that envy. The children of Israel were immigrants here because the Persians now conquered the Babylonians, right? And so it was during the era of their Babylonian captivity, but the Persians were now the rulers of the land. Well, God still blessed and elevated Mordecai, right? He was a Jew, just as the same way that Daniel had been elevated, but it only instigated envy of the hosts, right? It's not all hosts that will be envious, right? Obviously, the king of those people, the king of the hosts, they appreciate the skills of people like Daniel and Mordecai. Like, there's something in the Bible that says a man who excels in his work will stand before kings and not people of low people, right, or common people. And this was what was happening to Mordecai. It happened to Daniel, and so they would face persecution, right? They would face persecution because of who they are by their hosts. There would be envy, and we saw this envy going on again with in the case of Isaac. So I'm going to do another video, and I'm going to read the scriptures and just do a deep dive. So I guess let me end it with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So there was a law that they were to bow down to a golden image made by the king, but they refused because they worshipped God. And so the penalty was to throw them into the fiery furnace, right? So immigrants in a foreign land would face, there'll be laws that are created that are adverse to them, inherently inhumane, threaten to destroy who they are, their autonomy, their personality, their faith. But they were thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to worship the golden image because of their faith in God. They don't worship graven images. It would be a violation of, the Bible, the part of the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt not worship any other being, make a graven image, or bow down before it, because God is a jealous God. And so they believe that God is able to save them, but if he didn't, they would still not bow down to the golden image of the king, right? So they were thrown into the fiery furnace, but there was one as the Son of Man who protected them in the fiery furnace, and they were not singed, their clothes were not singed or scorched. There was the smell of smoke did not even stick to them, right? And they were protected, and they got them out. And the enemies were thrown into the fiery furnace, right? The enemies instead suffered the fate they designed to destroy the children of God. And so just to remind us that God protects his children, as many of us are immigrants amongst our hosts. So it's 50-50. There are those hosts who will elevate immigrants for their skills, for their favor, for the blessings of God. But there'll be those who want to persecute immigrants out of envy, right? Just like the Philistines were envious of Isaac, the same way the Babylonians were envious of Daniel. The Babylonians and the Persians, right, who took over from the Babylonians, and the same way as Haman was envious of Mordecai. So this is a common theme that immigrants have to encounter, but God's provision and his protection is sufficient, and his grace. My name is Oluro Timiosha. I'll do another video and I will read directly from scripture these passages that I've narrated. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.